The AOC AGON AG275QZN is a flat VA 1440p 240Hz monitor, and for those who are aware, that is actually pretty rare in the market. Now in the UK can be found for roughly £440, and in this video I'll be giving you everything you need to know about the monitor so that you can make your own informed purchasing decision. Before proceeding, I would like to thank AOC for actually sponsoring the video. Now to kick off this video, I would like to point out its display input, and this is of particular interest for those people who are limited, for example, to a HDMI output, such as if you are playing on a laptop. Now the monitor has got two DisplayPort 1.4 inputs and two HDMI 2.0 inputs. The latter will give you the ability to go to 1440p at 144Hz, and if you do want to get 240Hz over said connection, you'll have to go at 1080p. Thankfully, the DisplayPort inputs will allow you the full bandwidth capabilities of this monitor, and therefore will be able to attain 240Hz at 1440p without any chroma subsampling. Now with that out of the way, let's talk about its gaming performance, and here you can see that I objectively tested its input lag at a whoppingly low 2.1 milliseconds, but note that is with the low input lag mode enabled. If I were to disable low input lag mode, it jumps up significantly to 5.9 milliseconds. Now I'm not really sure why you'd ever want to disable low input lag mode, given that there is no inherent negative effects in having low input lag mode enabled, and furthermore given that the mode enabled also runs simultaneously with adaptive sync technologies and also HDR. As such, you'll always want to have low input lag mode enabled at all times. Now just to further emphasize the point about its objective data that I attained from it, here you can see how it compares to 1440p monitors, and indeed at the time of filming it is the fastest monitor that I've tested to date, at least where input lag is concerned. So what about when it comes to its response time? Well, here you'll be able to see the UFO ghosting test in terms of the different overdrive modes that are on offer with the monitor's OSD. You have got off, weak, medium, strong and boost. Now I should mention over here, boost mode is the equivalent of having MBR in terms of its maximum level, and also the overdrive set to strong. As a result, you can see that the UFO is a lot clearer, and yet the inverse ghosting is somewhat similar to the performance that one can attain on its strongest mode, overdrive. Now digging a little bit deeper, I had the monitor tested via the OSRTT tool, and here with the overdrive mode disabled, the average initial time, which you can see on the bottom left hand side of your screen, sat at 9.98 milliseconds. Moving over to weak, it drops down to 9.02 milliseconds, down to medium 7.47 milliseconds, and then at strong it significantly drops down to 3.03 milliseconds. Although you will note over here that the RGB overshoot, which you can see on the middle of your screen, does become a lot more apparent, and indeed is in line with what I noted with the UFO ghosting test. Now due to testing limitations, I was not able to get a figure for the boost mode overdrive, although I will say that it's very similar in terms of performance to the strong mode overdrive. In other words, its response time will be similar to what you should be able to expect, and therefore you'll be able to take the strong mode overdrive tests as a result of what you would be able to expect on the boost mode overdrive. Similarly here, the RGB overshoot is very much noticeable, so it's something worth considering. Now MBR mode will clear up the picture, but will also cap the overall brightness. Specifically in MBR 20, the maximum level mode, it will become pretty dim, something worth considering if you're going to be gaming in a bright sunlit room. So which overdrive mode would I select? Well, I would actually opt for the medium overdrive mode. While it doesn't have the best sort of response time, specifically in comparison to the strongest mode overdrive, it will give you a far better visual experience, and as a result it's something you might want to consider when you're getting this monitor. Speaking of its visual experience, the monitor has got display HDR400 certification, and indeed from my own test I did notice over 400 nits of total brightness, specifically in HDR. Now in this respect, you do also have a few different HDR modes that you can select from. The display HDR one will only be available when you do have an HDR signal, while the other ones will be present in an SDR format, although will try and simulate an HDR image. Frankly, you will want to only use the HDR mode when you actually do have an HDR signal being fed through, and will probably want to go for the display HDR option, as it does give you a slightly bettered experience. Now moving swiftly on, we get onto its VRR technologies, and here it has got AMD FreeSync Premium, although in my case I was able to run NVIDIA G-Sync while connected over a DisplayPort to my RTX 3080. Indeed, here I had no sort of black screen or flickering issues, be it when I was running the NVIDIA Pendulum demo, or better still when I was playing Destiny 2. Here I was able to run NVIDIA G-Sync simultaneously with HDR, 1440p and 240Hz, all of which worked in tandem without any sort of problems. Now it's worth considering here that given the technologies that is built in, that the FreeSync or indeed G-Sync range that you should be able to expect is 48Hz up to 240Hz, of course when connected over to DisplayPort. If you were to run over an HDMI port, it will be limited to 48Hz up to 144Hz. Now to round off the gaming section, I should have a quick word for console gamers, and here you will be able to run 1440p at 120Hz and also 1080p at 120Hz. Better still, this monitor does also accept a virtual 4K input, and therefore in my case, using a 4K Blu-ray player, I was able to output 4K HDR at 60Hz, and indeed is something that you should be able to attain if you have a modern day console. Now with the gaming section out of the way, what about when it comes to image quality? Well, here the monitor runs a 27-inch VA panel that runs 1440p at up to 240Hz with no chroma subsampling. Now in this respect, the monitor also has a dedicated sRGB mode that can be selected via the OSD. In said mode, I had its sRGB gamut coverage tested at 90% and the gamut volume at 93.7%. You can see here how it compares to the sRGB standard. The average delta-E sits at a really impressive 1.07 with a maximum of 2.43. As for its contrast ratio, it sits at a stonkingly high 3092:1, something that an IPS panel could never achieve. As for its measured white point, it sits at 5830 Kelvin at 100% in comparison to this 6504 Kelvin target. As for its gamma curve, it sits very close to the 2.2 standard. Now this monitor does also have a wider color gamut, which does become immediately apparent when you look at the gamma coverage and the gamma volume. Indeed, in this warm mode preset, which is what it was tested here, you can see here that the Adobe RGB and DCI-P3 modes have significantly expanded. So much so that the graph below is actually comparing it to the Adobe RGB standard, and equally the average delta E and maximum delta E are being compared to the Adobe RGB levels, whereby they sit at 2.86 and 8.05 respectively. The tested contrast ratio does not change, while the measured white point does shift slightly at 5826 Kelvin at 100%. Yet again, the gamma curve does sit very close to the 2.2 standard. Now I did mention that I would talk about its brightness, and here indeed it has a max HDR brightness of 452 nits. The maximum SDR brightness sits at 388 nits, and as for its minimum SDR brightness, it sits at 34 nits, therefore showing good range. Here the sRGB mode is also capped in terms of brightness and locked at 250 nits, therefore not giving you any sort of brightness controls when you are in said mode. Equally, in the MBR20 or boost mode brightness levels, it will be sat at 55 nits. Speaking of peak luminance, this does perfectly bring me onto brightness uniformity, and here you can see how my tested panel performed. Of course, this is somewhat panel lottery. And as for its backlight bleed, here you can see how my tested panel performed. And indeed, it's something of a selling point of VA panels, specifically in comparison to IPS alternatives. Because here, if you're going to be playing a lot of darker games or consuming movies that have got a lot of darker scenes, the increased contrast ratio and the VA panel technology might be better suited to you. So next up we get onto the monitor's OSD, which can be accessed through a physical joystick button found behind the monitor. Now here in the game settings you'll find a plethora of different options. Now MBR has 20 level increments, whereby the maximum will be the best in terms of low motion blur, but of course will limit the peak brightness, as I did touch upon before. Now, adaptive sync cannot be used simultaneously with MBR, and equally the boost mode overdrive, which effectively replicates the strongest overdrive mode with MBR set to 20, will not be appearing over here if you have adaptive sync. Now, as I did mention before, medium overdrive is what I would suggest with this monitor. Then you have got low input lag mode, which you'll certainly want to leave enabled at all times, and then you can enable or disable a frame counter. As for the luminance, you've got the contrast, which you'll probably want to leave as a default setting. You've got the brightness, which is of course very subjective, the gamma levels, which you'll want to leave on level 1, and DCR, which I would leave disabled. As for the image setup, this only adjusts the HDR picture. When there is an HDR signal, you will also see display HDR popped up on your screen. Then in terms of the color setup, you have got a variety of different color temperatures, where in my case I actually preferred using it on the warm mode preset and actually leaving it in terms of the default RGB values. You do also have the sRGB mode, but note when you go on the sRGB mode, it will limit the brightness, whereby it is capped to a certain level, so that might not be agreeable to some people, so therefore you might want to go on the warm mode preset or the user mode preset. Now, aside from this, you do also have some extras, whereby you have got the off timer if you want to enable or disable it, some information about the monitor in terms of the resolution and the refresh rate, and also if it's feeding an SDR or an HDR signal. And as for the volume, it is worth considering over here that this does not have any built-in speakers, but rather this is the volume that's outputted via the 3.5mm headphone jack. So this is quite handy if you have, for example, a console plugged in. Then as for the OSD setup, it is pretty self-explanatory, but you'll definitely want to ensure that you have got the DP capability at 1.2/1.4 in order to benefit from the max refresh rate and resolution of said monitor. Now, moving past the monitor's OSD, I should mention that this monitor has got a 3-side borderless design and a relatively thin bezel at the bottom. It has a black and red finish, which can be noted towards the back of the monitor, although towards the front you will not really see a black and red finish. Indeed, this might be appreciated to certain individuals, as the stand is finished in an all black color instead and has got a triangular design. On that note, the stand itself provides height, tilt, pivot and swivel adjustments, therefore making it ideal for finding the right ergonomics. Of course, if you do want to replace the stand or have a monitor arm, you can place it via a VESA compatible stand. Aside from this, the monitor has got a small little headphone stand that props out towards the side of the monitor, making it useful if you want to place your headphones or of course your gaming headset by the side of the monitor. So there we have it, my overview of the AOC AGON AG275QZN, a 1440p 240Hz flat VA panel. I'd be curious to know what you make of it down in the comment section below. Now, I'd like to thank again AOC for sponsoring this video, and of course for you guys for tuning in. If you've enjoyed this video, definitely do consider dropping a like, subscribing and hitting that bell notification, of course if you haven't done already. As such, I've been Totally Dubbed, and I'll hopefully see you in the next one. Take care of yourselves, and goodbye.